research focuses. I'm gonna give the word to each one of our 4 speakers to speak for about 8 minutes about a couple of questions that I sent them before. I'll let you know which questions they are answering beforehand. But before that, I'll introduce the panel. I'm gonna start with the people outside of Oxford. We're very happy to have Jessica Mokuti, who is actually an Oxford Net Zero Fellow, specifically focusing on inclusive net zero. He has an extensive expertise on climate finance. I mean, you've registered for the event, so you probably had the opportunity to read more about them. We are very happy to have Jessica Mokuti, even if she could not join us here in person today, because of her expertise in Sub-Saharan Africa, thought from a more global perspective. The second person I'll introduce is Dr. Isian Son. He's assistant professor in international development at the University of Bath, not too far away from here. And I'll just stress one of his latest publications, the book Certifying China, published by MIT in 2019. His expertise in East Asia, particularly in China, and how regulation happens in these economies seems to be very relevant today. Just to bring some context, for example, two sessions ago, when we were listening to Aline Soterroni's Oxford Net Zero Fellow panel on Brazilian deforestation, pretty much 1/3 of the whole conversation was about China, and China participating in global regulatory efforts to curb the global impacts of global value chains like soy. So clearly, the topic of what's going on in China, how do we think about China, how do we think about developing countries' own successes or efforts to regulate are going to be very interesting to us. So thank you to Jessica and Isian to joining us online. So next, I'll present Dr. Deborah Lay. She's the Chief of Energy and Natural Resources Unit at the UN Economic Commission for Latin America. She was also lead author of the IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees, one of the lead authors. She also happened to have a PhD from the University of Oxford, which makes it a very nice cherry on top of all her expertise and the opportunity that we have to have her here in person. And obviously her expertise is mostly on Latin America, and particularly Central America. But obviously, as part of the UN system, she also has this comparative global perspective in mind. And finally, I'd like to welcome Dr. Wale Abayade. He's the Director for Government Enablement at the Global Alliance for People and the Planet. Previously, he worked at USAID in South Africa, leading some very large efforts on investment in the region. He has a doctorate in engineering. So with that, actually, we have also a very diverse panel in terms of backgrounds from engineering, natural sciences, and social sciences up there in the screen. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us here as speakers or as listeners. Let me tell you what questions I sent the panel members. So the first question was, what are you looking to learn when you look at different regions and countries? In practice, in your everyday job, either a researcher or as a policy or a project deployment implementer, what kind of things do you look to learn when you look at different countries? But I also asked them to answer another question, and I gave them 2 options for this second part of the answer. And I wanted to know kind of more on the methodology. How do you compare or extrapolate lessons from developing countries? Like, do you have a particular methodology? Do you have a tool that we can also rely on, that we can borrow to do these kind of comparisons? Or alternatively, if for the particular regions where their work is mostly focused, whether there's something that's really interesting on climate change that we should be looking at, that most of us might probably not know of, because it's not obviously in the main media that we read in the US or let's say the UK, which are pretty dominant. So hopefully we'll also leave the room with some good news of things happening around the world that we should keep track of. Having said that, pretty long introduction, I won't take more time, and I'm gonna first ask again our speakers online. Jessica, if you can take the word.
Thanks, Jose. Hi everyone. It's really good to be here. It's been a while since I spoke to a large audience. So yeah, thanks very much for having me. As Jose mentioned, I lead work on inclusive net zero at Oxford Net Zero, and our team's job is to think about how net zero works in the global south. We focus on 3 regions, and so that's Africa, Latin America, and developing parts of Asia. And what we do is think about, and so basically I'm answering your first question, Jose, is what we do is think about what does net zero mean for each of those regions, for each of those groups, sub-regions, so the regions in general, but also the sub-regions, because transitions to net zero will require decarbonization in different sectors, different groups, different method, different pathways for decarbonization. And so what we're looking to understand is what does net zero mean in each of those regions, but also being more specific and thinking about how can net zero occur in a very just and equitable way. So who needs to go first, who will go last, who puts in more effort as compared to others, who pays for what. And so that's what we're looking into. And so what are the principles for achieving equitable and just net zero? And that's kind of at the core of our work. And so examples of questions are how are different groups, how are different private and public sector actors framing net zero? What do they think is important for net zero? Is it technology? Is it capacity? Is it financing? What exactly, what pathways are they prioritizing? What sectors are they prioritizing? But also what actions are they taking at the moment? And what are those that have been planned for the future in order to transition to net zero? And to do this, I think we're definitely designing research programs that engage with these different jurisdictions or different groups. And so, for example, we're starting research that is looking at businesses in very specific sectors, so the private sector within specific sectors in the 3 regions, to understand how they're planning to transition to net zero. And so we're looking at, for example, the agriculture sector, the infrastructure sector, to understand how they intend to transition to net zero, but also to understand some of the challenges that they are likely to face when they're designing their transition plans or implementing them. We're also designing research that is looking at very specific areas that are required to ensure that net zero is credible, that net zero meets net zero meets the standards, the global standards for credibility. For example, making sure that there is transition to net zero by 2050, that there is a very specific transition plans that are put in place and implemented, that there's finance available for transitions to net zero. What we're learning, I particularly focus on Africa, and the most important thing that we've learned so far is that developing countries or global south regions are setting up plans for transitioning to net zero. And so there's very grand plans by both public and private sector. And so if you've been listening to what's been happening since COP26, 27, and now in preparation for COP28, you'll find out that developing countries are setting up plans for transitions. For example, there was the Africa Climate Summit, which was centered around green transitions. And there was a lot of talk about how the green transition can be funded, the technology that is needed. And so that is what our research is finding. But then there's always the need for enablers to enable these countries and these groups to transition net zero. And so what we plan on doing over the next few years, next year or 2, is to understand what those needs are, and what is needed to plan those needs. And so where can we move finance, where can we move technology or capacity, where can we build institutions to enable that? I'm sorry I've gone on for a while, but yeah, happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Jessica. We'll get back to you with questions on some of these specifics. Etienne, please take the floor.
Thank you, Jose. It is my great pleasure and honor to speak in this panel. And yeah, I'm sorry that I cannot join in person and at Oxford, but I hope I'll see. It's very difficult to speak while not seeing the audience. So I think hopefully next time I can come in person. Um, so the kind of the motivation of my research when I started my PhD until now, it's always trying to understand the kind of changing role of emerging economies or power in the global south, in global sustainability or climate governance. So I think the question to me is really how these players or relatively new players with increasing power in the global system engage with dominant transnational governance initiatives. So I started my research by looking at what happened in global commodity supply chains, looking at those transnational standards or certification schemes, and now in the past few years, increasingly look at the net zero, because I think when I did my PhD, there was no discussion on net zero, and suddenly everyone's working on net zero. Of course, I think it's important to see how things will evolve over time, and yeah, if we can make progress. I think here there are kind of a two-step question. So first is how these actors in these countries, in these places, engage with initiative developed or led by global North actors. So what are their role in these global North dominant initiatives? And the second one is if they don't really get involved or participate much into this initiative, what are their own initiative, what are their responses to these Northern-led initiatives. I think what we have learned, and not only through my research, but the work of many other colleagues, is that we have to recognize the agency of Southern actors and trying to understand the relationships between the state and the market in these places, and trying to explore the variations across different contexts. I think, yeah, of course, the conventional wisdom would say, oh, maybe the development needs, it is true, is a priority of Southern states. But of course, now we know tackling climate change and having sustainable development is a dual goal, and you can't separate the two. So I think countries or like policymakers or elites in these countries, they recognize the importance of climate and environmental goals and trying to see how they can engage and address the challenges. But of course, at the same time, they face the challenges in terms of capacity and knowledge. I think, and also in different contexts, we have to pay attention to the social norms and cultures. I think these are important things we have to take into account. And this is why, of course, it's important to study China, but I always situate my work into a comparative context, to looking at how the lessons learned from China can apply to other emerging economies, especially large emerging economies like BRICS countries, but also like South-South interactions. So between emerging economies or developing countries, what are the interactions to shape their position in the global system? So this is just like a very brief overview, and hopefully give you some sense of what I'm doing. But I think on your second question, very briefly, so how do we compare? I think, I don't think there is a kind of gold standard in terms of comparison. I think as a political scientist, we always remind ourselves to not compare apples and oranges. But I think it's very difficult to have that perfect comparison. So what we need to do is to be mindful of context. I think it's important to really look at what's the relevance to this specific context. I think give you a very simple example to think about the kind of the role of the state. And then the first question is always to identify who or what are the actors who belong to the state. And then the answer to these questions varies. For example, in the case of China, you could treat industry association as part of the state, whereas in the Western context, it's very much a private associations. And also state-owned enterprises. So what are their positions? How they what are their influence on how they influence the whole policy processes. I think we have to be very careful. So yeah, I think I'll just stop here. Hopefully, yeah, we can discuss more in detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Isian. Both have been very interesting entries into our discussion. I'll continue with Deborah, please.
Yes, thank you. Well, good afternoon to all. Thank you for the very kind invitation. It's a pleasure to be back in Oxford. So as Jose Maria mentioned, I'm going to focus more on Latin America. And I think that the first thing to learn is that Latin America is very homogeneous. Even when we separate between North, Central, and South America, there's very...
but I think you meant heterogeneous?
Yes,
not different.
Sorry, heterogeneous. Yes, haven't had enough coffee and I'm still jet-lagged apparently. Sorry, yes. So we need to take those also specific contexts into mind. For example, in Central America, the different, well, of course, the role of colonialism, the different civil wars that have taken place in the different countries, and then right now, the different issues related to drug trafficking, violence. So all that shapes the context of energy. So just as an example, you would have Guatemala, and that some of the best wind energy sites are run over by drug traffickers. So I mean, I don't think it's because drug traffickers really like wind energy, but it just happens to be in those places. So, you know, that is one of the reasons why in some of the best wind regions with best potential, you don't have any development, right? So these specific, as my previous colleague just mentioned, is also the importance of taking context in mind. So for example, when you have Guatemala and Honduras, for example, more than 50% of the population still depends on fuel wood for cooking, which is in other countries is less than 10% or 5%. Costa Rica hardly has any of that problem, but you know, within also Central America, you have Costa Rica, who has probably 99.5% electrification rates and 100% renewable energy generation. And the main problem of Costa Rica now is that when you have an El Nino year, like right now, hydroelectric generation decreases, just like happened with Panama last year, and then you rely more on fossil fuels. So it's this, so these are like very specific problems that you can't tackle specifically at a regional level. I think in Latin America, you can also see a shift, for example, towards natural gas. Even if it's called a transition fuel, we're looking at contracts of almost 30 years. So then there isn't any room for additional renewable energy generation just because of these long-term contracts. But also, when we talk about Latin America in general having a high degree of, well, I mean, a high percentage of renewable energy generation, there are some countries that are important oil producers, like Mexico, even though the production is decreasing, but they import a lot of cheap natural gas from the United States, which also decreases the incentive to continue more exploration. But then you also have countries in South America, for example, where there's a lot of lithium from salt marshes like Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina, which of course also drive are trying to drive the market for electric vehicles. But then that also opens up the question of what happens to these fragile ecosystems and the numerous indigenous populations that live there. So so that's kind of to answer the first question of, you know, there's just in every specific, you know, even when we talk of subregions within the different countries, there's just a mix of problems, of different issues in different contexts. And also to add that in many of the countries, there's an important number of indigenous populations. Just for Guatemala and Bolivia, more than 50% of the population is indigenous, many of them rural, low levels of education, high levels of poverty. You know, that also you know, answers the question of when we talk about a just energy transition or net zero, what does it really mean? And while some countries with higher development in the region might focus on electromobility, for example, or just electrification in general of all sectors. Other countries would focus more on energy access or energy poverty. Just because in many parts where the grid has been extended, electricity is still unreliable. So you have a lot of voltage peaks that burn out your appliances. In some cases, people just can't afford, you have where the grid is, but you just can't afford the connection fees or the service. And in other cases, you're just too far isolated and you need standalone. But the question is then, how do you maintain, for example, the battery in the case of a standalone photovoltaic system? And then you come to think of what are the new market mechanisms that are needed? Like, do we need to have more focalized subsidies for access? Or, for example, if we want to do efficient wood stoves for cooking, or do we want to try to implement, start the shift from fuel wood cooking to natural gas? And then comes a question of, well, we really can't do natural gas because there aren't any distribution centers nearby, because there aren't any roads. So then you have to start, taking 2 steps back and thinking, well, we need to build the roads, we need to build like telecommunications, we need new codes and standards of how to protect these users from, like how to avoid gas cylinders just burning or exploding, and how to avoid having the problem of, for example, women, instead of carrying big loads of fuel wood, carrying gas cylinders, which has happened. So you don't want to have that shift in problems. So then just shifting on to the second question of what we have been doing, and I'm going to talk specifically about ECLAC right now for the Subregional Office of Mexico, which that does Mexico, Central America, Cuba, Haiti, and Dominican Republic. We have a sustainable energy strategy till 2030 for the SICA member countries, which is a sustainable, the Central American Integration System, which does all of Central America and Dominican Republic. So the strategy is basically looking at how to meet SDG 7 related to energy by 2030. But so even if we have mirrored the Agenda 2030 in this sense, on terms of access to renewable energy and energy efficiency, for the majority of the goals, we only have clusters of 3 countries that are prioritizing certain goals. So for example, talking about energy access, you would probably have Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, and El Salvador for both access and fuel wood. For renewable energy, you'd have the majority of the countries. For not everybody's prioritizing energy efficiency, just because some countries have more progress than others. But this also, I think when we're talking about regional goals, it helps also share better experiences, for example, of what has worked between Guatemala and Honduras in terms of how you implement efficient stoves, how you include men and women, and what does, also following one of the previous speakers, when you talk about equity and justice, what does it mean? Like when you have, when we're trying to be gender inclusive, does that mean just including women or also women and men? And I mentioned this because there's this example in Honduras where we're implementing efficient fuel cook stoves, and the training was only focused on women. So men didn't know of the difference in the autonomy, how you had to chop the wood, how long it took to cook. And when we did a follow-up visit, it turned out that 2 women in one of the communities were beat by their husbands because the food took a couple hours more to cook, and they thought they were just like not taking care of their families. So then that highlights where in specific contexts, it's not just something about women, but also including men. But even when we're talking about net zero, there's also the topic of you need to think of adaptation and resilience, that there are some options that while you reduce emissions, you can also increase vulnerability, or not taking the right approaches can increase that vulnerability. So here I highlight another example of the region from a small scale, community scale hydroelectric plant that we visited after a hurricane. And it turns out that women were afraid to use the electricity because of electrocution. They thought it was safer to use candles because with a candle, you don't get electrocuted. And 90% of the men would respond that they prefer to use electricity because it was more dangerous to use the candle because the candle would blow over and cause a fire in the house. So, you know, how did that difference in perceptions come about? And our research didn't extend that far, but it was enough to know that we had to address this difference in perceptions, because you can have the hydro, but if people don't use it, when you have an extreme weather event, an emergency, to go to a shelter or, you know, a health center, then that is certainly a problem. So just to answer the third question of what type of institutional innovations are needed, I think is, you know, just going back to the topic of regional differences and knowing about the indigenous population, and with the context of civil wars, is that social conflicts are still happening. So public, private sector, whatever type of energy development you have to do, you want to do, you have to think of social conflicts and how to resolve them, how to start building that trust. And that even when you talk about something that at least in Central America has been more simple as a regional codes and standards for different appliances in terms of energy efficiency. You know, there's only agreement for a certain number of appliances and not all, because it's like, who has the lab and how do you monitor, and what countries have more funding than others? And then therefore, when you get international assistance, you know, what type of, who gets the lion's share of the funding because you have more or less capacity. So it's also a matter of how to balance those different interests. But having said that, and just to close, I think in Central America, we have a really good example of the regional grid. It's the energy integration system for Central America, and it's a grid that connects Guatemala to Panama. And that I think the only comparable one would be the one of Europe. And that even though this grid has, you know, there's been plans to extend north to Mexico and south to Colombia, there's also, beyond social conflicts, is, for example, the big protected area between Panama and Colombia that would cause you to have to do it under the ocean, which also has its environmental complications. But I think that there are some examples that show that this regional cooperation is possible despite the stark differences that you have within each country's structure. I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. I think you cover a lot of ground, and we'll come back to some of those points. Vale, please.
Yeah, thank you, Maria. And really, I'm grateful for the opportunity. Really great panel, and to sport, I think, telling you earlier, second time. Hopefully this time I get to see a bit more of the city in Laos. So even though, yes, I have a doctorate, I don't think of myself very much like that, and I haven't for quite a while, because I'm very much in the other side, you know, out there. And honestly, this is also great because I get to come back and talk to like cool academics, because we certainly don't see ourselves on the outside as cool in any way. Yeah, just so in addressing the first question, I think it would be helpful to talk a little bit about what the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet is, the organization I work for, because that will contextualize a lot of what I say and how we're looking at this question. So GEAP, Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet, and yes, we know it's a terrible acronym. Sure, there could be. I've thought of something better, but I think Global Energy Alliance was taken, so we had to add the P and P. So GEAP was set up by three of the largest philanthropies around to try to sort of like do what large philanthropies have been doing in other sectors, especially health, where they sort of like play a big role in being a part of the problem as an considerable resources that philanthropies have. So to do that in the energy access space. So Rockefeller Foundation, those three, Rockefeller Foundation, the Bezos Ed Fund, and the IKEA Foundation came together and committed $500 million each. Say, let's make a big bet. Let's bet heavily on low and medium income countries, supporting their growth, their journey towards addressing energy access, especially in a decarbonized way. So hence their energy transition. And so we were created about 2 years ago. And the strategy, basically, the way we see how we can help solve this problem is through three levers. One is, and two of them really speak to the enabling environment. One of them is government enablement, how we work with our government partners, because really, does anything work if government doesn't have the right policies and the implementation capacity to deliver those policies well? The other is, that still speaks to enabling environment, is the market enhancement, creating the right kind of market to the entrepreneurial activity and financial flows that can be directed towards energy access and energy. And then the last lever we pull is actually direct investment of, the small money we have. And we hope that by pulling these three levers, we better able to unlock. We don't just do them to solve the problem, because philanthropic capital is still too small. What's the scale of the problem of energy access? Many of you will be familiar, but we're looking at trillions in dollars per year to be able to address the 600 million people, or so many of them in Africa, who are not yet connected don't have modern energy access. So to unlock that, we're hoping to put our own few billions by using these three levers I mentioned to unlock money, hopefully from the private sector, where a lot of these trillions are, and also actually from the public sector as well, especially when it comes to overseas development assistance. So that enabling environment side is how I'll say, answer our first question on what we look to learn, is really understanding that first we want to wrap our minds around what has been the critical barriers, the critical unlocks that's been preventing growth in this energy access question. Because by solving for that, then you can actually solve for energy transition as well. And so that happens to also be my focus. So my personal focus in that, again, Jeb does a lot of things along these three ways. We try to deploy capital for projects, for programs. We try to work with the private sector. But specifically what I will be talking to today is the kind of work in creating an enabling environment, particularly with governments as partners. And there, I'll just answer this question that we're looking really hard for how to identify the kind of mechanisms for that can cause systemic shifts and transformation, that can move countries from low capacity to high implementation capacity over a relatively short time. And there are unfortunately not a lot of great examples for doing this. And so it is tough work, to put it mildly. But I think that's really what we're looking for. But there are small pockets of great examples that I could talk to, that we then look to try to sort of like benchmark. And this leads me to sort of like your second question, and what are the ways, the tools, the way we think about, I wouldn't talk about it as compare. I would say more, again, benchmarking. We try to create knowledge exchange platforms, because I think, as you were mentioning, Deborah, local context can be so massively different across geographies, and even within a certain geography, across functions or disciplines within governments, that it's not as easy to just, like, comparing two things doesn't always give you that much insight. But creating a platform where someone who chooses to learn can find a place where they can learn from other people's experiences in a way that makes the most for their own context, but also developing their capacity to do that in the first place, are where we are seeing that we want to put a lot of attention. We want to put as much of our attention. We think that by doing that, we might start to wrap our hands around this sort of like ways in which you can achieve systemic shift. Because again, the climate challenge is massive and it's here. I'll maybe stop there. The last question is where I would really want to spend a lot more time on, but I think it's better maybe we come back to that.
Like the innovations.
The innovations.
Thank you, Thank you, Wale. Thank you for all the panel members. I think these were really great introductory comments. We've run almost half of the time that we have, so it's tough to call it just an introductory phase. But we're gonna go into going into details of your answers, and we're gonna start gathering questions from the audience as well. So I have a set of questions to make to the panels, and I'll keep running them. But I'll be very happy to stop my questions and start taking questions from the panel as soon as you have them. But just to get this going, I really like the sort of, I'm gonna take Deborah's comment or introduction remarks as a kind of pushback on the idea that we can or should do comparisons across global regions. Particularly because within regions, or within what we would call global regions, Sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, Latin America, there's so much difference that we should be careful to. So I'd like to hear from the other panel members on this issue and how you see the issue of having, big difference across neighboring countries, and how you come across that in your own work. Deborah spoke about the difference even between Central American countries. I guess if she had mentioned Mexico and the contrast with a Central American country, the difference would have been even larger, right? So if anyone wants to raise their hand to start answering that, I'll see Wale already kind of thinking of the answer. So please go ahead. And I'm gonna nudge Isian to hear from him to ask one of his subjects of studies, China. It's just hard to get a bigger country than that if you're thinking on comparison.
Yeah, I think really quickly on this one is just to use an example of South Africa, where within one country you have massively different, I would say, energy and climate outcomes in that one country. In fact, sometimes at a city level, and this speaks to inequality and equity and historical injustices that South Africa has faced. And so when you compare South Africa to its neighbors, you'd find that South Africa has 80%, almost 90% electrification rates, but most of the rest of its neighbors have in the 40s%. So how do you actually compare both? But if you look deeper within South Africa, you actually find that there are parts of the country that still have 40% electrification. And this go to the point where comparison between countries and within the region always has to be taken a massive pinch of salt, buckets of salt, because it's only as good as what the local context allows. But that said, it's still helpful for people to see how others have walked their journey, no matter what that context is. So that's why I said we will look at it as a very useful exercise. It's something that we all, and we as JEP, we're actually global, so we have presence in Sub-Saharan Africa, in Southeast Asia and Latin America. But I think the more important thing is comparison is from a point of view of learnings and knowledge exchange.
Thank you, Wale. Isian, do you have any comment?
Yeah, sure. So just very quickly to follow up. So first, because Jose, you asked me about China, so I think I want to stress that China is a huge country with a lot of variation within the country. So it's very much like if you study China, you can always open the black box and look at variation within the country. So really to see what are the different motivations, agendas of different subnational jurisdictions, and then within different jurisdictions, subnational jurisdictions, given the context, local context, how, for example, my study look at a lot at private actors or businesses, so how businesses react to those contexts when they're trying to promote sustainable development or climate action. So I think there has been a very rich literature on that. But I think it's definitely, I think that makes sense to do that kind of comparison. But also when we do cross-country comparison, I can speak of my more recent work, which looks more on China's overseas engagement, so climate and environmental impact of China's overseas investment or development program. So in that line of inquiry, I try to do comparison across countries in different host contexts. Of course, I think we have to bear in mind that although there are some kind of principle guiding China's overseas engagement. When things applied on the ground, you always have to adapt to the local context. I think that's the challenging part, to understand the local politics, so how foreign actors interact with host country actors. I think it's not easy to do like a strict comparison. So you have to really find like perfect examples. But I totally agree what has been just said. It's more about kind of promote opportunities or create opportunities for knowledge exchange to see how we can learn. So for example, developing countries, when they deal with Chinese investors, what are the things they can learn, what are the good practices. And then of course, there is always some processes of trial and error. So if you want to apply some good practices from other contexts to your places, I think it takes some time. There's a learning process. I think sometimes we have to be patient. I think that's something not only for our research, but also like in practice, in policy practice, and to see what works, what doesn't work.
Thank you, Ishin. This was very insightful. Especially, maybe we can return later to the question, the point of patience and its many meanings. But Jessica, do you have any comment on this point of interregional difference? How do you deal with that?
Thanks, Jose. So what we're observing is that countries and regions in the global south also recognize that there's differences amongst them. And that's a good thing. Knowing that each person is at different stages in their net zero journey is kind of creates some level of optimism that we're more realistic. We're not being overambitious, but also global south countries and regions are also exercising their agencies by identifying what they can offer to the transition. And so what we're seeing is different forms of partnerships to support each other to transition to net zero. So we're seeing Sub-Saharan Africa countries partner with each other, but also with other regions. And so, for example, as Ishan said, is Sub-Saharan Africa countries working with China, but also EU-Africa relations or EU Latin America relations. I'm not sure if that's those are currently ongoing, but we're seeing different forms of partnerships to enable different countries to leverage their strength to maximize their transitions to net zero.
Thank you, Jessica. I think this is a really good point to continue discussing, because it relates to one comment made by Isien on South-South interactions. So you right now didn't only talk about South-South interactions, but rather wider multi-directionality of interactions. So I think I think it would be a good opportunity to listen from all of you on some interesting example that you know of these interactions between kind of South-South cooperation, or maybe it's trilateral cooperation, or some other interesting cases of these learning happening, maybe not in your own daily work, on your daily research, but that you've seen that it's interesting and the audience should maybe know about. I'm not sure if, Wale, your answer to the third question was related to this, but maybe you can also sneak that reply in this answer. So who wants to comment on these South-South or multi-directionality interactions?
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, happy to give an example. Actually, one that we we are as GIAP actively and deeply involved in, which is on the just energy transition partnerships. I'm not sure many of you are aware of this, where G7 countries have been coming together to create a climate finance mechanism for specific global South countries to help finance their energy transition. So the first of those partnerships was signed at COP26 for South Africa, so South Africa JET-P, as it's called. And then very quickly afterwards, there were negotiations on the Vietnam JET-P and the Indonesia JET-P, and now Senegal JET-P, I think, is probably going to be fourth in that pipeline. And so what those JET-Ps, again, they're essentially climate finance mechanisms, you know, to organize how climate finance flows specifically to energy transition projects in specific countries. But that headline, you know, encapsulates some really, really very difficult issues. Because many of these turned out to be, you know, when you open a cover and look into this announcement made, like in South Africa, it was an 8.5 billion announcement. And when you look at it, the questions around, well, how do we track this money? Well, first of all, where is the money coming from? Color and the flavor of this money, how much of it is concessional, how much of it is grants, how much of it is loans that these countries have to, like South Africa had to pay back. And if South Africa has to pay back, then why, you know, what's the point of it? How is it sort of like climate finance? So there were all those questions that South Africa had. Vietnam and Indonesia had some versions of all these questions, but then they had other questions because in Vietnam and Indonesia is about closing down coal power plants because they had overcapacity. In South Africa, closing down coal power plants actually means load shedding. So while these countries had different issues, the fact that it was all under JET-P mechanisms made us, and in partnership with some of our other partners in philanthropy and traditional DFIs, to start to bring these countries together to create a learning platform for JET-P. And that, again, is, you know, the first one I think we held in November last year, where South Africa, again, was head, started to talk about their own experiences, and that actually helped influence how Vietnam and Indonesia negotiated their own JET-Ps when it got to the point where they had to get to brass tacks. So yeah, that's, I think, one example that we are hoping to do more of around many different topics. Another is, for instance, we're recently setting up the a battery, a BESS, basically global coalition around battery energy storage, which is really critical for the uptake of variable renewable energy, you know, across the globe. We find that many countries are still struggling to be able to do that at scale in their countries. So we're creating this this platform to allow countries and utilities within countries where they can go and learn best practices. So yeah, those are some of like practical examples of how we're trying to do this. But I mean, again, the devil is in the details, because it's have the platform, but actually making it useful requires a lot of work, a lot of maintenance, a lot of TLC.
And just to go into a little detail on this, so the main users of these platforms are policymakers, utilities, officials, the larger NGO community,
indeed, the wider stakeholders, as well as, interestingly, even the funders. In terms of JET-P, a lot of the money, again, was coming from G7 countries. And so they're listening on these platforms to hear the problems and the issues, and how South Africa, for instance, is tackling things they're having to deal with, and they're negotiating in closed doors. They sort of like South African Corps that talks about it. So they also hear. So it's all of that and even more. And of course, the platforms are themselves sort of like organized in such a way where you can have more confidential conversations, and then you can have more open ones. And the idea is to speak to all of these potential stakeholders. So, yeah, open the process to them.
So this really goes back to your point on, rather than comparison, platforms to learn about what's happening in multiple places. Great. So who wants to go next? Deborah, then we'll go to online.
Yes, thank you. So going back to Latin America, so I had talked earlier about SICA, the Central American Integration System, but there's another regional block that's called Proyecto Mesoamérica, the Mesoamerican project that includes SICA plus Mexico and Colombia, where some joint work has also been going on, mainly on energy efficiency standards. So it's more, I think, where you can see, for example, that Mexico and Colombia have a greater leadership and more advances in terms of energy efficiency than other SICA member countries, perhaps except for Costa Rica. So that's one example of South-South, and not the word in English, but also no Spanish, so
Decalogue, I think it's
okay.
Hopefully.
So they created this decalogue, yeah, of South-South cooperation that are kind of the principle that they use. I think that the one that's emerging right now is in terms of lithium, because a lot of countries want to take advantage of that market. So earlier I mentioned the lithium triangle of South America that's based more on salt marshes. But Mexico is also trying to enter that in the north, and Sonora, trying to extract from rocks. So then there's been, even through ECLAC, there's always an annual kind of training on lithium extraction, the different policies and regulations that need to happen. What are the what are the different market incentives in comparison with other regions like Australia, China, and the US, and what potential does Latin America in general really have to commercialize lithium? But then there's also the question of why the countries haven't adhered to the EITI initiative and looking at the different social and environmental impacts, or the different like natural resources management tools that are created by the UN Economic Commission for Europe, by UNESE. But that's still kind of in progress, because I think at least in region, well, at least in North and Central America, the topic of lithium is still more emergent than in other parts of the country. But then there's also, for example, at the level of Latin America, there's this initiative called RELAC, in which the countries must have been in the COP that happened in 2020. A COP that didn't happen in 2020 because of the pandemic. That's where the region, where Latin America committed to having 70% renewable energy generation. So that's the goal. So if you compare with SICA member countries and the sustainable energy strategy, we have 65%. But when you take a region, I mean, it doesn't mean that everybody has to have 70%. It's just an average. So some countries like Dominican Republic that have higher fossil fuel generation would need to increase renewable energy generation, but not up to 70%. But then, of course, you compensate with other countries like Costa Rica. So these are different examples. I think the last one.
Sorry, 70% by?
Yeah, 2030, yes. By 2030. But then when we're talking again about net zero, I think something that's emerging, not entirely South-South, but there's a big South-South component is, for example, with the European Union, CBAM, the Carbon Budget Adjustment Mechanism, and what impact that has on the different countries. So at least in the 5 sectors that are being prioritized right now, probably SICA doesn't have a big impact there because they don't commercialize that much in like some of these minerals. But that opens the door also to what happens when CBAM expands or other carbon mechanisms come in place, and what does the country do the countries need to do to prepare? And so I think that it's these are conversations that are just starting. Who is producing what are are your primary or secondary player in the supply chain, and what does it mean for every step? And I think it opens up the question of how prepared we are as a region to be a player in these carbon markets, which brings us back to the equity and justice component, but also that the region also needs to be a strong player in it. Thank you.
Yeah, I think this is very interesting because it connects with Isien's point again on how our countries or actors in developing countries reacting to strategies and preferences of dominant players, traditional dominant players in the international scene, and where they are kind of reacting and joining or trying to set up alternatives. In this case, it's like, how do they prepare for the foreseeable initiatives taken by, let's say, European Union as a dominant player within commodity markets or others. Etienne or Jessica, do you want to comment on these last issues, particularly these kind of multi-directionality collaborations? Etienne, let's take you first. And assume that you wanted to talk.
Is that me or Etienne?
Or Jessica, go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So I will mute myself. Sorry.
We are gonna take Etienne first.
Okay, no problem. So yeah, we didn't hear like who did you name, but yeah, I'm ready to speak. So I'm happy to give some examples, namely initiative led by China, in terms of like South-South collaboration or China-led international cooperation platform. So I think now we all talk about the Belt and Road Initiative. So by default, the BRI is a kind of loosely defined broad network of cooperation to increase connectivity. But on sustainability and climate change, I think well-known or noticeable initiative is the BRI International Green Development Coalition, initiated by the Chinese government, namely the Ministry of Ecology and Environment with the UNEP, but also involving a lot of international NGOs and think tanks like World Resources Institute, Energy Foundation. So the idea is really to create a platform of learning and to share knowledge and good practices. They also organize a lot of kind of pilot study to identify pathways to transform, for example, China's investment and financing in different contexts. So there have been some studies on that, on this initiative. They are still growing, and I think they recently set up like a secretariat in Beijing and trying to really like institutionalize this coalition. I think, of course, time will tell us where it will go, but I think it at least shows a very strong signal, like from Chinese perspective, as an emerging power, they also want to show this is some kind of inclusive initiative open to developing countries and get involved of recipient or host countries in the process of promoting green development in different contexts. And since we have the other example, since we have talked a lot about critical minerals, I think in that area or in that space, given the dominant role of China in the supply chain, the Chinese actors, especially industry actors, are also very active. And some of you may know the Responsible Cobalt Initiative developed by the CCCMC, the Chinese, the largest Chinese mining industry, and they also try to expand this initiative from cobalt to cover other critical minerals and to involve countries not only in Africa, but also in other regions, especially in Latin America. I think the initiative seeks to kind of learn from this transparency initiative developed by global North actors, but really build something as a kind of South-South cooperation and give more say and voice, of course, power to actors in different countries. I think one noticeable aspect is they do some capacity building projects in host countries, but I think I'm trying to be critical. Sometimes I think as a researchers, we want to know what are the impact. It's quite hard to see. I think transparency is always an important issue. So how you can really demonstrate that you are making impact to local communities. I think this is something we will see, but at least I think we are in the process to see more and more kind of South-South cooperation platforms or initiatives and taking place at a global level, so not just at like a regional level or sub-regional level. So probably mainly because China's changing role in the system. But I think from from like dynamic point of view, I think we have to see how this kind of initiative will evolve, or what the kind of responses they will get from global North actors. Of course, I think whenever China develops some kind of initiative, there will be some pushback by Northern actors. I think to me, it will be an interesting era that we are entering, is this kind of competition, and whether where we are going from this competition. That's, I think, something I'd like to see more thinking, reflection. I think I'll stop here. Maybe Jessica, you can jump in.
Yeah, thanks, Yusian. So I'm holding a little human. You could see his head. He's just put out a large scream when I started speaking. So when I think about South-South partnerships, the one that comes to mind, which is probably, there's probably better examples, is the African Free Trade Continental. The African Continental Free Trade Area. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, I always confuse the acronyms. And it's a very good example of countries being very proactive about developing South-South partnerships. And so that's basically a continental partnership to advance trade, but also to advance partnerships in collaboration on how to achieve green growth objectives. It's just being operationalized, and so the structures are being put in place. We're yet to see very good, very strong results from it, but then it is something that has a lot of promises, and so that's one example where we see developing countries being proactive about developing partnerships with each other to leverage their own strengths to advance their own objectives. One thing that I'm usually concerned about when I think about partnerships and collaboration is that these usually follow the easiest route. I think there's a proverb. I'm not sure I'm not sure where I found that from, but it's a river follows the easiest route, and so a partnership will always be created with the easiest partner. And so you'll find that countries in specific regions are more likely to have partners than others. And so if a country is undergoing civil unrest, if it has if some countries are fairly unattractive for some partners, and so you'll find that there are countries that are more likely to be left behind, even when we're talking about South-South partnerships. And so I think in this case, for net zero, there's likely to be certain types of partnerships, and then there's likely to be others that are less sought, but that are less advanced, and that are less likely to produce results in terms of transitions. And so I think my point here is, I'm sorry for the long talk. My point here is that when thinking about South-South partnerships, you also need to think much more critically about what those partnerships create, what opportunities they create, but also the exclusions that they create. For example, a very good example is when you're thinking about partnerships on energy, or partnerships on minerals, or even skills development. Countries that are in conflict, countries that are extremely least developed, are more likely to be left out because they probably will be thought or assumed to have nothing to offer. And so in our work, we think about what do these countries that are likely to be left behind, what would they need to participate in such schemes, or to benefit from existing structures. And yeah, that's it. Thanks, Jose.
Thank you, Jessica. I think this final point really speaks to Deborah's comment on the experience in Central America, or the larger Latin America, where some countries can take advantage of opportunities that others can, because they already have the labs, or they have already institutions to really be the ones that grab those opportunities. So let's move into a phase of audience questions. We can take questions from the audience here, but also from the audience online. So please, let's start with here.
So I have two questions. My first question, I guess, is for everyone. I think when you talk about so my research focuses on China, Africa, And one of the big pieces of the climate change conversation this year, as far as Africa is concerned, is the conversation around debt and the fact that if you already have a high debt burden, you know, climate change is probably the least of your concerns because you're just trying to service your debts. And I just wonder the extent to which that factors into some of the work you're doing, facing, you know, net zero and the wider climate change conversation. My second question, and please feel free to take the mic from me. It's a very selfish question, and it's for Dr. Ishen. So my research question is, to what extent does Chinese economic activity affect how Nigeria and South Africa participates in climate change multilateralism? Now, just hearing that, what is your instinct for research methods? And, you know, feel free to ignore that.
So anyone taking the questions first?
I'll answer the second later. Maybe I think we have colleagues from Africa, so please go ahead.
Okay, I mean, the debt one, you're right. This is definitely top of mind for a lot of countries now. We're getting to that cycle where that happens, I think, years or something, where a lot of countries are in their debt limit almost at once. And we've seen the experience in Zambia, Ghana, where they actually default, likely to default. I think this also came out during the Africa Climate Summit, as well as something that countries need to think about. And as you probably know, as part of the whole climate finance discussions, there's been this whole idea of, is there a way that you could do some sort of debt swaps and allow countries to use money they would have used to service their debt to sort of like invest in climate. And I think those conversations are happening. That's the one thing to say. But I think then just to take it back to your point about when conversations are happening, they do present an opportunity, a different way of finding to finance things, but it's only to the extent to which that countries themselves have the capacity to take advantage of this. That limits what happens there. And that's where I'm hoping that, at least, Alexander, where we can come in, because we do have this, again, intention to work to reduce enabling environment barriers by focusing on building state capacity and working with our government partners to enhance their capacity to do things, not just their capacity to write another policy or another regulation, which we now see happens a lot, is very quickly to just put in a regulation. But how do you actually go and negotiate this sort of like debt issue? A whole other thing that requires a lot of focus, and unfortunately, there's no shortcuts to it. Like, you just have to spend the time and the effort. So I think it's good that this is there and it's been discussed, but I think the limitation is likely to be the fact that not all governments can come to this sort of like this information. And yeah, I'm gonna leave to address the second question.
Sure, yeah, happy to take. I just want to add what Will said in terms of the debt swap discussion. What I heard, as far as I know, there has been also some discussions within the Chinese government, and so financial institutions, and trying to learn what are the practices, international practices in the past, and then to see or potentially consider use these kind of tools, but I think it's still at a very early stage because we know that China is very conservative debt relief and also like applying certain instruments. And on the second question, I think it's a very interesting question and definitely want to know more about your research. I think it would be very fascinating. Just please feel free to get in touch. But I think to assess how Chinese activities affect climate action in Africa, I think it seems to me it's a very long causal chain. So I think it's a very long process. You probably have to identify what are the key steps, like to see how Chinese activities would affect climate actions of the countries that you want to study. And yeah, so what are these pathways? I think I would urge you to be a bit more specific, and then trying to assess different pathways to see. Yeah, I think if it's empirical analysis, and then to get data to conduct some robust analysis on this kind of causal processes. But I think I hope that's helpful. But yeah, anyone else want to jump in? Jessica.
Please go ahead. Jessica wants to answer.
Yeah, so I agree with Wale. I mean, debt and climate action and net zero has, I mean, those three themes are discussed quite a lot. But one thing that, and I agree with Wale too, one thing that we're noticing is that thinking, which is research, policy, thinking, is light years ahead of action. So researchers have spent a lot of time thinking about how do we address the debt issue within African countries, but also developing countries in general. But then there's a few cycles. It's a few cycles ahead of what's actually happening, and what we need are institutions that plug this gap. And so, there's just getting a debt swap is a very long process, and in most countries, it's even longer for countries that for very if you're a certain type of country, then you have a longer process in doing that. And so what we need are institutions that can help these countries and groups of people to translate research much more quickly, so that we're able to meet our net zero goals by 2050. I think that's it. I don't know if that makes sense. It's kind of that ensuring that the research is quickly able to be translated into what countries actually do to address their debt, climate action needs, or climate action priorities at the speed that is needed.
We'll take more questions. I'll just add to this reply that this also about, I think Jessica's point is also about how institutions should better think about the evidence that they gather to make these decisions. That might not be, that has to also be renewed. Jessica? So there's more people here in the room. I couldn't see who raised their hand first, so maybe we can take it, yeah, like that. So maybe let's take two questions together to see a little bit of time. So please go ahead.
Thank you so much. I'll have a question about international investment in shared infrastructure, which is a topic on which I'm working on for a project called Energy Justice and the Social Contract. And I was wondering, do you have examples from the Global South of shared infrastructure, energy infrastructure, whether it's transport, distribution, extra, but where the framework, including like the legal contractual workings, are shared between different countries, different actors? And if I may, very quickly, a second question about what you were mentioning about trust and distrust. I'm very interested in this because I'm working on a project of solar to hydrogen infrastructure in French Guiana. And there is currently a very strong conflict between indigenous communities and the French government and the French operator for this infrastructure. And so I was wondering, do we have other examples where this trust and mistrust system has happened, and what happened? Thank you so much.
Take a second question, please. Maybe over there.
Thank you. Actually, a comment that's going to lead into a question with a real example about lithium that was mentioned a couple of times. One size does not fit all. And not even the same country. We are seeing this with Brazil and what happened with Bolsonaro and Lula, how policies are changing drastically in the Amazon. But going back to lithium, the real example is that Bolivia and Mexico, they proposed to create an OPEC for lithium, organization for lithium exporters, which was rejected by the same neighboring countries. So Chile, Argentina rejected that because this is right now a competition. So we have now Chile kind of with Boric, president socialist, trying to be very state-owned vision. Argentina, the other way around, very open. And now we're going to have probably a new president in Argentina and Bolivia in between. So the only common ground, the only main thing in common all these countries have is that China is present there, and they want to reach out to China. To a lesser extent, Australia, but for the lithium process, which is one of the key, processes in the energy transition, including net zero and other aspects, that's going to be very complicated, even if 3 neighboring countries that are so-called brother countries cannot agree upon key terms. So the question is, as Jessica said, what are the opportunities, but what are also the challenges and exclusion for this process? How do you enable this under the current context, especially in under the current economic situation that we are facing? Thank you.
Yeah, so let's hear from panel members. I guess we can start with Deborah. We'll return to more questions, don't worry. So please go ahead.
Sure, thank you. So let's see, from the first question on shared infrastructure, I can give the example of the CIEPAC, which is the grid that connects Guatemala to Panama, which is actually like a 7th shared electricity market. So you have each country, of course, has its electricity market, and CIEPAC is like the 7th umbrella one. So it really shouldn't be viewed as a competitive market, because what it enables is, for example, like in the case of Costa Rica and Panama with El Niño, that with CIEPAC you could have a greater exchange of renewable energy generation from other countries instead of buying from fossil fuels. I mean, that it sometimes is used as a competition market is another topic. Just as a further example, Mexico has an interconnection with Guatemala, but Mexico's line is not connected to CIEPAC. So it's supposed to go, it goes to Guatemala, feeds into Guatemala, and then it's supposed to feed into the regional system. But what Guatemala does is it purchases everything and then sells it as its own, So of course the prices aren't of the regional market, but that's just a separate parenthesis. But to your question specifically of how finance goes, is that because it's a 7th electricity market, it has its own regulator, it has its own company. So you have the regional owner of the infrastructure, you have a regional wholesale market group, and you have a regional regulator. So these regional entities are formed by national, by like the national counterparts. So like the regional regulator entity has a representative of each of the national regulating ones. But the funding for the project goes to this regional entity, doesn't go to any one of the national ones. So between all the countries, and in this specific case, it was ECLAC and the Inter-American Development Bank mainly, but not exclusively, the different formats of the contracts and regulations were developed. So basically, for example, in the case of natural disasters, countries put in a certain fee every year. And right now, because of the degree of the natural disasters, that amount is always used up. So countries need to putting in more or getting more like different aid assistance when you have different hurricanes. But it goes to the national entity. So I hope that answers your question of an example. The other question on trust is that the examples I have are from Central America, are from when the different countries were reconstructing from the Civil War. So basically trying to assist the different surviving refugee communities that, for example, had to hide up in the mountain in uninhabitable areas, and many of those are still not electrified today. And the trust issues derive in the first place from colonialism. What are the perception of foreigners that you're just come and take my resources and take my livelihoods away and not help me at all, to distrust between themselves. Because of course in the different Civil War, if you weren't with the army or you weren't with the guerrilla, then if I didn't know you were of my team, then I just kill you on the spot, right? So there was a lot of that, and it really takes time. So when you have budgeting periods that say, well, you have to finish the project in 2 or 3 years, or maybe 5 in the best case scenario, depending on the communities and their specific context, sometimes it's just not enough. You know, it's not enough to go and say, just, you know, to check something on your checklist and say, you're going to have community participation, have 2 meetings, and then just say, I'm meeting my requirement that way. But you really have to understand, like, the perceptions, the expectations, what are their fears, for example, and, you know, really try to gain that trust. So in Guatemala, right after the Civil War, some of those projects took, I would say, 8 years before we were able to break ground on a hydrant. Was it a worthwhile investment? Absolutely. Would any other donor do that right now? Very unlikely. But the thing is that you can't build trust in one day or in one visit and say, I'm going to do this and I'm going to paint your school or give you new benches or build you a new health center. And that's how I'm going to show you can trust, because perhaps that's not what they need. You know, it's like some communities where there's hydro developers and the developers build water tanks or paint the school or whatever. And what they really need are roads, because the roads that they maintain by hand are destroyed by the heavy machinery and equipment that is constantly passing. So then the local people can't go and commercialize their agricultural products. You know, so these are just some examples of trust, because trust is not just going, it's like, how much are you listening to me and understanding what I'm trying to tell you and how you're going to address it. But I'm happy to continue this conversation on trust, because I know it's very, very big. And just very briefly on the one on lithium, I think that for the countries of the whole region, I think it's very important for them to subscribe to the EITI, because they have standards that help address the social and environmental issues. But then also going back to CBAM, you know, would CBAM consider adding lithium to the list on what needs to be not just based on carbon, but also on like the different social and environmental impacts? You know, how many manufacturers of electric vehicles take that into account when you know, when we're talking about, is it really net zero when you have an electric vehicle? You don't take into account all these different social and environmental impacts to the local community. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. So does anyone else in the panel have a comment on the issue of trust or the negative or risks or kind of unintended consequences regarding these transition minerals?
Another example of international investment into shared energy structure. Based on the Latin example of that line from Guatemala to Panama, I know that the Southern African power pool, so utilities in Southern Africa are trying to copy and learn from that. They've had a regional market for a while, but most of it was built out of bilateral agreements with countries. But they want to move to a more market-based situation where, based on the sort of like the market trades between themselves, they're able to attract investments from the private sector to expand on these sectors. And that's working out quite well. So initially, yes, that's what we've seen. There's a lot of interest from the private sector, certainly the international private sector. But you usually need to have ODA, like, you know, government, DFIs, the government financial, the government will need to start the first one and the second one. Then when they sort of like prove the model, then it allows for you to leverage it. And I could also say that Eastern Africa and Western Africa are looking at these examples very closely from Southern Africa.
Very interesting. Jessica, Isian, do you have any comments on these questions?
Maybe just very briefly on the lithium question. I think we are just in a very interesting time, and I think the whole critical mineral discussion or issue has been highly politicized, especially in the US. So I think that kind of creates more challenges to have better cooperation. And something I think probably help us understand why countries cannot agree, because there are more players coming. And yeah, I think I'll just stop here. Hope we have time for more questions.
Yeah, maybe we'll take one more question and do a round of closing remarks. Can we take the question over here? Very brief, please.
I'll make it brief. I really want to bring this discussion back to first principles. Climate change. Climate change is a world problem, not an individual country. So therefore, one needs to come up with substantive solutions. Burning fossil fuels. But what does net zero mean? Net zero means stop creating CO2. And there are no substantive solutions being presented here or in any of the other Oxford University net zero things. It's all about incremental change. But we need substantive solutions to a problem that is increasing its ferocity in climate change all around the world. So it has to be a world solution, not one of individual countries. And so really, the leading research organizations really need to get hold of this and start understanding that the research has to be in the area of substantive solutions, not incremental change.
I think this is a really good comment, because it's always important to keep raising our bar on what we should be researching and focusing on. We are essentially out of time, so we're not gonna be able to have a round of final remarks. I just want to take 20 seconds to let Wale give a kind of community announcement. I think it's going to be interesting to some people in the audience. Please go ahead.
So I'd asked Jose for permission to put a plug for JAP, and that when I talked about this whole idea to figure out a systemic way to help countries build their capacity, we're building a team that will help us think through that. And one of the people we're looking for, people with interest, with a background in this, specifically an intern, to start with, someone with postgraduate sort of like interest in energy policy or climate policy. Know of that person, or if you are, please reach out to or Jose, and he can reach out to me. Yeah.
Thank you, Wale. So you can actually you can find my details in the Oxford Net Zero website there for fellows. So thank you again to the panel and to the audience. We are done here today. Hopefully you found it interesting. Thank you.